Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A couple things I would love for you to walk away with from this talk. One is that compassion is the foundation for success. And that's one of the keys I want us to walk away from, because I'm going to talk about some of my experiences in both the military and on Wall Street, in sports and playing football and baseball that is not commonly taught, especially to many of us growing up. And I want to make sure we walk away with that one idea of that compassion leads to success. The other, and this is really important for, especially in the pandemic that we're in, that compassion is different than empathy. And I'm going to make the argument that empathy creates burnout and compassion does not. And they are two separate ideas, two separate concepts. So those are two of the basic things I want you to walk away from today's discussion. Now, let's get into what I call SOS. I always like to say, this is the structure of how the talk is going to go. This talk is based off my latest book with HarperCollins called The Compassionate Achiever. And we're going to talk about not only the science of compassion and this guy named Charles Darwin, but I'm also going to throw in, for those of you who know, a little bit Barry White as well. And I promise to keep this all above board. I'm glad to see some of you laugh about that. Yes, we're okay on terms of the discussion about what compassion does, and what I call the Barry White effect. But I want us to start with the definition, because I was also a debate coach, and you can win a debate on the definition, right? We call it topicality. And if your definition is stronger and more inclusive than others, you can win a debate just on comparing definitions. And I want to make sure when we talk about compassion, how we actually define it. And I think you all deserve to know how I define compassion. And it's very similar. I got to spend a few days with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and have breakfast with him one morning, specifically on this topic. So I also come at it from a pretty darn good teacher as well from His Holiness. And then we're going to talk about why compassion. We're going to talk about the sinew of you, right? The strength of you, how it builds you up. And that's what we're going to get into, the difference between empathy and compassion, right? Because empathy, I'm going to argue, can cause burnout, where compassion does not. Compassion actually strengthens you. And we're going to talk about that in a bunch of different ways. And in that section, we're going to talk about success in many different ways. I'm going to branch off a little bit more on success in learning and success in leading as well. And then we're going to talk about how to compassionate, right? It's the 4-step process that I talk about in my book called LUCA. And real quickly for you all, the LUCA, the L stands for listening. The U stands for understanding. The C stands for connecting. And the A acts to solve. Now, we're going to promise get through that. It's a total of 20 slides. We've already hit 2. And we're going to stop midway through for questions. But also, Jim is going to monitor the chat. And if there are questions that go to informing the discussion that's going on right then and there, Jim's going to interrupt me, and we're going to have a dialogue about that question. So hopefully it'll be a little bit more interactive as we move forward. But I just want to reiterate something, that compassion, and the reason I titled it The Compassionate Achiever, is that in this society, especially in Western culture, we see compassion as a weakness. Something is soft, something that can't get you to where you want to go. I argue we've been misunderstanding compassion, at least since the Victorian age. Abraham Lincoln had it right. This guy, William Shakespeare, had it right. Compassion is not just a value or virtue. I would argue it's also a verb. It helps us to achieve what we are seeking to achieve. All right. Reason I start with this photo is, if you can see at the top here, that's me right there. And this woman, her name is Scarlett Lewis. I don't know if you can see that. Right to the right of the young lady in pink is Scarlett Lewis. Scarlett Lewis is one of the moms of the Sandy Hook shooting tragedy. And we just had another mass shooting tragedy in Colorado, one last week in Georgia. She connected with me because she wanted to do something in schools that helped students develop social emotional learning. And so I wrote the neuroscience of that program for her. And the reason I love this picture is that this is the first school district anywhere in the United States. It was in Hawaii. It's one of the poorest school districts. They adopted our program. The short story is that they improved 20 points on their standardized testing. And now Hawaii uses it in many different other places. We didn't change textbooks. We didn't change anything else. We basically introduced the idea of social emotional learning and how that can actually contribute to learning. And we're going to get to the specifics of that a little bit later in the talk. However, we started in a circle. And if you see my definition to the left, right, this 360 degrees understanding, I love the fact that this group started in a circle and then we developed the heart. Because compassion is not just about understanding, it's about acting. And they acted to create this heart for Scarlett. And let's just quickly go over this definition. And Jim, please watch the chat if there are any problems with this definition, because we can't go any further, right? Unless everyone's okay with this, right? It's this 360 degrees, or I like to say holistic understanding of a problem or suffering of another with, and then you can see that the second part, a commitment to act for solving the problem or alleviating the suffering. So it's two parts, right? It's this understanding or seeking to understand, and then to act. You know, I'm just going to pause right there just to make sure everyone's cool on the definition about what compassion is. I promise we'll get into the difference with the empathy soon, but I just want to make sure we're on the same sheet of music. All right, Jim, I'm not seeing any issues right now. All right.
Looking good.
All right, good. So I like to start with a guy named Charles Darwin on compassion. When I say survival of normally to a group, and I'm hoping that someday we can meet in person again, everyone yells out, the fittest. And everyone thinks Charles Darwin came up with that phrase. Just so you know, he did not. He hypothesized something like that on the origins of species, but he didn't say survival of the fittest. A philosopher named Herbert Spencer did and brought it to the United States. And the reason I bring this up is because Darwin wrote The Descent of Man after much of his research was done. And in chapters 2, 4, and 5 of The Descent of Man, he argues against the simplicity of the phrase survival of the fittest and actually makes fun of people who believe in survival of the fittest in that book, the one that's up on your screen. He says in The Descent of Man the following. He said, Charles Darwin says that the species that will move up the evolutionary ladder the most efficiently and effectively is the species that will have the highest number of its members as, and this is Charles Darwin's word, sympathetic to each other. So if you really think about Charles Darwin, if you actually read Charles Darwin, which I did not, so my 5th and 6th grade biology teachers, I need to talk to them because they gave me the Cliff Notes version of Charles Darwin and not the actual writing of Charles Darwin. But if you actually read Charles Darwin, it's survival of the freaking kindest, not survival of the fittest. It's survival of the kindest, I would argue, or the most compassionate. Paul Ekman and others have looked at what Charles Darwin meant by sympathy, and he meant 3 different things in different books. One was altruism. Another was generosity. Can you guess what the third one is? It's compassion. That is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin then tries to bring this home in the Descent of Man. That's why you see the little monkey up on the title of the slide and also the picture of the little American monkey, because the zoo that he visited quite frequently when he was writing, there was a primate cage, and there was a larger primate and then this little American monkey. And this little American monkey, he describes it in The Descent of Man, by the way, this story, that it was deathly afraid of that larger primate. And every time it was coming to feeding time, the little American monkey, Charles Darwin would write, would always wait for the leftovers because he was so afraid of that larger primate. And this example is to bring home his point about having more people who are sympathetic to each other. He says this, he goes, I witnessed as the caregiver was laying down the food and turned his back to the larger primate, that larger primate decided to charge the human caregiver. That little American monkey who was deathly afraid of that larger primate ran and intercepted that larger primate, risking its own life to take care of that human caregiver. Darwin uses that example to bring home what he means. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you, there's no doubt in Charles Darwin's mind what it took to have a species succeed. It wasn't being ruthless. It wasn't being self-interested. It was looking out for each other. Can you imagine if our society had a little bit more compassion? I would argue we would have a much better, more successful society. And you know what? Charles Darwin also said the same thing. It's not just Charles Darwin. I would argue the world's preeminent biologist, E.O. Wilson, talks about altruistic group selection in his work. And Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famous for the social contract, right? That's what we know him for. But he talks about how we're all born with natural compassion. And we unlearn, according to Rousseau, our natural compassion. We're all born with it. That we unlearn it through society. Just as an example of that, because many of us, I have 3 kids. I see Dr. Catherine Franson here, one of my colleagues. I know she has children, right? And one of the things I got to teach on a Fulbright over in Europe, in Estonia. And I had to explain this idea of realpolitik, right? This idea of being self-interested or seeing the world in zero-sum terms, right? That if one person gains, that means another person has to lose. Well, in countries, some leaders see the world that way. And so I used an example in the United States, you know, Catherine's kids, my kids. One of the games they play on the playground are examples of that zero sum. For example, King of the Hill. What do we do in the United States? People get on monkey bars or top of a hill and they push down other kids. And I was using this as an example to explain to one of my students at the University of Tartu, a young Polish scholar. She asked a great question what that meant. And so I was given these examples. In the United States, we play King of the Hill. Oh, another example, Kill the Carrier, where we throw a football and then every other kid attacks the one kid with the ball. And so when I was done, I explained that's what realpolitik and zero sum means. And that's what I was explaining to her. And she goes, thank you, Dr. Kukk. And for about a split second, I was like, yeah, I nailed that. I used the right example. And then she said this, that explains so much about the United States. And then I went, whoop. I went really small because they don't play those games on the playground. It's what our kids learn. They learn from not only what we play in the playgrounds, but they learn from us. So when we talk about past generations or upcoming generations doing this or that, that is a reflection of who we are. We create the society that our children grow in. In other words, according to Rousseau, that if we have less compassion, we've created that society that creates less compassion because we're born with it. Charles Darwin argues that a species that will have more compassion will succeed. In other words, my work and what I'm talking about today is literally what the slide says. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. This isn't just neuroscience that you'll see, but this is also social science, biology, and the father of natural selection, Charles Darwin. Now, the neuroscience, and I hope you lean in on this one. I have on the left-hand side, Guernica, right? That's the 1937 bombing by Nazi and Italian pilots over Spain. And when you see Picasso's giant painting of this, it conjures up suffering. And so I use that as an example of what I think many in the world think of suffering, that we either can see on Google or that we can look at that's actually not of real human beings, but of a representation of that. And I use that because I think there's a different way of looking at suffering, and empathy and compassion offer 2 different paths. And the scholar on your right in that September 2013 Science article, Dr. Tanya Singer, brought the neuroscience out in front for all of us. I don't care who says that they came up with it first. It wasn't anybody out in California. It was Dr. Tanya Singer. She deserves the credit for this. And that's where I'm going to stop. It's all stop. She gets the credit, period. No matter what anyone else says. She found out that when we look at suffering, and she had people go into fMRI machines, that when you ask them to think from an empathetic point of view compared to a compassionate point of view, she saw that the two different sets of neural pathways were used on everyone. And just real quickly, empathy is about feeling the same emotion as someone else. Compassion is feeling warmth or care, or I call it the Cadillac of kindness, right? It's this understanding, and then you act to help. You don't have to feel someone's pain in order to help them. Guys, you don't need to have empathy to have compassion, right? And this, I call empathy actually a kind of an emotional quicksand. When someone's feeling down, if you're still feeling the same emotion, you get to get down, right? And nurses are highly empathetic. And one of the reasons we're facing a lot of burnout is that they are absorbing the suffering, I think, of a lot of patients. And if we can help them learn the compassion side, and I'm going to show you a slide on that. Yes, we can teach compassion. I think we help avoid burnout. And this is how, using Dr. Tanya Singer's work. Basically, what Dr. Singer found is that when we all think empathetically, we use the same neural networks as when we're in pain. So we're releasing things like cortisol. Then she had people think in compassionate ways, the definition that I gave you. And what she found, and this is amazing, is that when we think compassionately, we use a different neural network. It's the neural network of when we're in love. Like, I mean, real love. I married my high school sweetheart, been married now, going to be 33 years. When I think of my wife, Ellie, that doesn't take me down. That gets me on fire. When you're in love, it builds you up. It doesn't take you down. And so to think about compassion and empathy in a different way, think about when someone falls in a hole. An empathetic response is like, you see them down there, you jump down in the hole with them, right? The idea with compassion is that you see they're down in the hole, you give them a rope. You give them a ladder to help them up and out. And then that difference is between being stuck. I think that empathy can give you, don't get me wrong, I think empathy can help you understand something, but you got to be careful using it. Where compassion is focused on that action. Now, as only a good teacher, I can't just tell you my perspective. I got to give you two people on either side of me, right? And then that will give you a sense of like, am I buying this guy's argument here? Well, you don't have to. You can either go on the left-hand side of the screen, you see Simon Baron-Cohen, not Sacha Baron Cohen, the comedian, right? Simon Baron-Cohen, he believes in that book, 0 Degrees of Empathy. Empathy is the answer to everything. And to the right, you can see Paul Bloom from Yale. His title says it all. He is against empathy, right? He actually shows that compassion is the key and that empathy has led to tribalism and racism and wars in that book. I'm kind of the middle way. I think empathy can be used for understanding, but it's like fire to me. Just like in a New England cold night, a fire can warm you up. The problem is that you don't contain that fire and it jumps to the rug, it can burn your entire house down. And you have to be careful with empathy. Yes, it can give you that understanding, but man, it can take you down and depress you. So I wanted to give you, two other books that would challenge the way I'm coming at it to give you an idea like, yeah, maybe I'll take, maybe you lead towards the empathy side and you want to look at Simon Baron-Cohen, or you lead into the empathy side and you want to take a look at Paul Bloom's. I wanted to give you, it's only fair to give you people on either side. And I respect both authors and scholars. I think they do an amazing job in their respective books. Now, the basic neuroscience of it all. When you think compassionately, we, human beings, release the peptide hormone called oxytocin, not Oxycontin, oxytocin. That then activates two neurotransmitters. Dopamine is that reward feeling neurotransmitter you get, and serotonin, this kind of calming reward. Those two in combination create happiness and optimism and hope. And I would argue, actually, it's in that area of that happiness, optimism, but staying still calm, that resilience reside and success is built. And I'm not the only one. And I'm going to stop here. There's a number of authors. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'm trying to increase your Amazon book cart and your Barnes and Noble book cart here. We have several books that actually show and demonstrate this idea of the neural and social science of it through their writings. Paul Zak, the moral molecule, by the way, is oxytocin, and he talks about how dopamine reinforces that smile, gets us to treat others well, right? And gets and puts us in that serotonin mood. And then Sean Aker, who Oprah Winfrey has adopted as one of her gurus, he was at Harvard when he wrote The Happiness Advantage, right? He says that happiness is a precursor to success and talks about that. And when you look back at what I was talking about, each of the research and books actually flow into that discussion. So I'm actually going to stop here, Jim, to see if there are any questions, and then we can, finish up.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Actually, we do have a question. So where does sympathy fit in?
Oh, good question. Sympathy is something else completely. It's not empathy. It's not compassion. It's feeling sorry for somebody else. Right? It's not having the same emotion as somebody else. It's just kind of feeling bad for them. It's not feeling kindness. You may have sympathy, but that sympathy doesn't necessarily make you act on it, right? How many people have watched the APSCA, right? The animal cruelty videos on TV and not donate, right? You can have sympathy and not act. So sympathy, empathy, and compassion are all very different. And when you have sympathy for someone, you're actually kind of over them, right? You feel bad for them. So this is kind of looking down in a certain way. And so in that whole, let me bring up the whole analogy, because I think that would kind of tie it up. Empathy, you're jumping down in, right? Because you're feeling the same emotion. Compassion, you're giving them a ladder or rope. And how about sympathy? Oh man, dude, I feel bad for you. And you march on. That's sympathy.
Okay, so we had a question. Is there a psychometric test or survey for compassion?
That's another great question. People are working on that. Actually, I started working on that. And it's something I was bringing up to Dr. Franson as well, about potentially doing so. There are various institutes and centers working on that, but no one's nailed that down.
Okay, so we did have someone made the comment, the real work of compassion is being present for the burden of others' pain. And that got me thinking about the term compassion fatigue. So what can you say about that?
All right. Compassion fatigue, first off, is a misnomer. And I traced it back to literature of the 1980s in nursing. The nursing literature came up with that phrase before the neuroscience came out. I would love for the nursing literature to catch up to the neuroscience. It's really empathy fatigue when you look at what they originally write in the 1980s, not compassion fatigue. Once again, compassion uses the neural networks of love. When you're in love, Jim, and I'm not going to speak for you, I'm just going to speak for myself, it gets me wired and fired up. I can finish a marathon when I know my wife's at the end waiting for me. So this idea of compassion fatigue is a misnomer. It started in the 1980s before neuroscience has given us the insights that we have. So I would love for a rewrite of that. And I argue against that. And that's a misnomer. Just looking at the time, I'm going to pick one of these ideas. I wanted to, since this is the Science Museum of Virginia, I wanted to give you some citations and places that people can go to look up these studies. I'm just going to go on the rose-colored glasses side because a couple of my mentors accuse me of being like this, too optimistic. I actually am not. I would argue I'm not a half empty, definitely not a half empty or a half full. I'm a refillable dude. I think a glass can always be refilled, and we've forgotten that. But this study on the left-hand side from the Journal of Neuroscience from 2009 is pretty cool for the fact that it says, I don't know, I've been told that I see the world with rose-colored glasses, so I don't, quote unquote, see the real world. Well, what this study has shown, and this is pretty amazing, that pessimistic people actually have a narrower peripheral vision than optimistic people. So people who are happy and optimistic, actually check this out, all you naysayers. Optimistic, happy people see more of the real world because their peripheral vision is wider than people who are negative. That's all I'm going to say right there. And there's the science to prove it. So when you're feeling negative, you're actually seeing less of the real world. And people who say that those of us who see the world in rose-colored glasses, we're in la la land and we don't see the real world. Oh, you know what? You might want to check the science. I would say always check the science. All right. So this next slide, I told you we're going to get to a little Barry White. And I wish I can go that deep, but I can't. Right. And Barry White, all I'm going to say here is that when you play Barry White, he sets the mood for, whatever, with my wife, success. Let me put it that way. I argue, and as you can see on the bottom, that compassion has a Barry White effect. It leads to success because it creates an environment for success. And I'm going to talk about that right now with learning. Brain Rules, and it's a book I'm actually assigning to all freshmen here. I've assigned it every university I've been at to all freshmen. They have to read this book in terms of learning. John Medina, I do not know the guy. I don't get any cut, but it's a brilliant book for anybody who wants to read neuroscience. That's really easy to grasp, understand, and apply. He argues on, remember dopamine, right? Oxytocin, compassion, right? Breeds dopamine. It aids in memory and information processing. He calls it, and this is really cool, dopamine is a post-it note for remembering. So guys, think about it. If you're in a compassionate classroom, right, where I used to be as a young student in a Catholic school in New York City, the nuns would wrap your knuckles if you got anything wrong. I was not a very good student. I was scared to death. And then I went, I'll never forget, in 5th grade, everything changed. I went to a public school in Connecticut, and Mrs. Virginia Peck, who actually probably get arrested nowadays, she would actually massage every student for 10 seconds. Nothing creepy, right? But she would make us all feel relaxed. And she would ask us how we saw a problem if we got something wrong. She made it so compassionate. She listened to us. She asked us questions. I went from a C student in Catholic school to straight A's, where by the time I was done in high school, I graduated near the top of my class. And it was the learning environment that I transferred into. I wasn't afraid to ask questions. And I think when we create learning environments, they should be places where students feel comfortable making mistakes. Because I don't know about you, in the real world, you learn from your mistakes. And we've created learning environments where we don't allow that to happen anymore. Well, in the Cormier Honors College in Longwood, we'll take you, because we're looking to launch beyond what any other university is doing and how they do it. And we do it through the neuroscience of learning. That's just one example of that. Another example is that when you're talking about leading and learning, the Swedes have been following a gene called DRD4. It isn't something from Star Wars, R2D2, right? It's DRD4. It's a dopamine processing gene. And what they found out is that basically there are 2 types of DRD4. There's a long variant of DRD4, which reduces dopamine, and a kind of quote unquote normal one, which produces a lot of dopamine. And they put students in classrooms that were like my nun's classroom. They were really ruthless. It was based on punishment, and there wasn't really any rewards. And they looked at students who were in those classrooms, right, that both had the DRD4, the long variant and the regular variant. Well, the regular variant, they called the students dandelions because dandelions can grow anywhere, right? In between sidewalks, for God's sakes. And same with these students. They can grow even in rough, punishing, intense environments. And then there are orchids, the long variant of the DRD4, which, if you have to really take care to cultivate orchids, right? And so they decided that the Swedish studies, they labeled these students the dandelions and the orchids. Well, the ones in that intense environment, the dandelions they did okay. All the orchids failed. Then they moved them to a more compassionate learning environment where they weren't punished, where they were asked questions about how they saw it. They were nurtured. Not only did the dandelions succeed, but the orchids succeeded as well in their learning. And what's crazy is that the orchids surpassed the dandelions. So why wouldn't you have a compassionate environment, both in your team, if you're running a business, and in the classroom, if you know that more people are going to succeed through that one way? And the reason why that question, are you leading dandelions and orchids, is because all of us are leading both dandelions and orchids, not one or the other. So if you want to leave part of your team behind, which is very different than what I learned in the military as a counterintelligence agent, I was taught we leave no one behind. Why do we do that in society? It's mind-boggling to me. DRD for the genes. So can compassion be taught? Yes. These are some examples. And I know, Jim, I can give you and slide you my slide deck. So if people want to, get to these examples, I'm more than happy to get them to you. And yes, that is a picture of His Holiness when he was visiting the campus I was at that time. I was very excited. All right. So how do we compassionate? Real quick, I'm only going to pick one of these. Listen to learn. Lucas, the first letter. We live in a society that listens to reply. We literally don't take the time to listen to someone. I make sure when students come in that whatever papers are between me and the students, I take them off to the side and separate them so they know that I am giving my full attention to them. I'm going to take tree searching right there. That's a picture I took in the country of Estonia because I made this mistake. I've been helping cities and towns become cities and towns of compassion throughout the United States. And my very first attempt, which eventually succeeded, but I almost fumbled the football, was because I thought everyone was for compassion. How can you not be? I thought. And so I went in to see this mayor. And as soon as I was explaining the science of compassion and how it breeds success, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arm. I lost him. Remember, I'm a former counterintelligence agent. Body language says a lot. I'm reading his body language. I lost him. You know why? Because I didn't bother to listen to what tree he was climbing. And it was really obvious if I just took the time to listen. It was economics. He was looking to make his city more economically vibrant. So what I did is I went back and I framed compassion as how it helps leading to economic success. And believe it or not, The Economist magazine and the Financial Times had articles the previous year on this. There was a town in Hawaii that took the Dalai Lama's curriculum on compassion. And the short of it is their scores went up. Their standardized test scores went up in that town in Hawaii, a poor district. For anybody out there, what happens to the real estate prices of a town where the economic scores go up? The real estate prices and the values go up. I framed it in that way. And that mayor then pushed to become a city of compassion. We need to take the time to listen to what other people are doing, how they see the world. Listen to what trees they're climbing. Understand to know. I'm just gonna, up on the right-hand side, I don't know if everyone can activate and chat, or Jim, for this time, could you just unmute everyone? Just for this moment. And I would like people to yell out how many rows that you see that pop up in that right-hand section. How many do you see?
4.
8.
8.
4.
8.
8. 7. 8.
Right? Everyone's seeing something different. Right? It all, when I mean about understand to know, you need to understand to know what you need to do to help someone, because you have to understand how they see a problem. And you could hear everyone. I didn't put those voices up. 8, 7, 4, 3. It's how a person sees that that column. That is actually set up so that people would see different columns and rows. So if you look at it from left to right, you see 4. If you look at it from right to left, you see 3. Well, if you want to help somebody, truly help somebody, you need to understand how they're seeing the problem, not how you're seeing the problem. Then you'll know what to do in order to help them. And that gets to connect. You'll be able to connect them to capabilities, that's the C in Luca, that can actually help them. Now, I'm just going to go to multiple identities. All of us have multiple identities. For example, I'm not just a professor. I'm not just a dean. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a former counterintelligence agent. I'm a former semi-pro baseball player. I'm a veteran. And when a student came to me at my former job, I had to assume my veteran position, not my faculty professorial position, because he came to me, and when he sat down, I could tell he was carrying a 9mm loaded weapon. He sat down in my chair and he told me that his daughter, who had a heart problem, was back in intensive care, and his wife was missing for 2 days and found off of what they called 684 up in New York. She was just off the highway, but crashed off the highway that no one could see where the car was. So both the loves of his life were in the hospital on life support. He was telling me he's coming in to quit college. Now, you just don't come in to tell a professor you're quitting college unless you're also reaching out for help. But I knew I was not trained to help him. I had to connect him. And the short way I connected with him is that he won the Purple Heart in Iraq because he saved his men in his platoon. I reached back as a fellow veteran and said, it appears to me that what you did for your men in Iraq, you're not doing for the loves of your life. And he asked me what the heck I was talking about. I said, you gave it all for your men. And now you're willing to throw it away for your wife and your daughter. And he goes, what do you want me to do, Dr. Kukk? I said, I want you to trust me like your men trusted you. I need you to walk over with me to get some help. The short story is I knew I had to connect him to capabilities. I knew I had to connect with him to as a veteran, but connect him to people that can actually really help him. He graduated from that university and has his own business now, and his wife and daughter are fine. But if I thought I had all the answers, I'm not so sure that would happen. I had to connect him to people who had better answers than I did. And that gets to act to solve. I actually walked him over to the counseling center to get it done. But let me go to the final countdown because it reminds me of the 1980s song, all right, the final countdown. How you act matters. The reason that you have stoplights there and a countdown timer is that 2 countries in Asia were trying to reduce traffic incidents. And they used countdown timers. One used it to reduce traffic accidents at red lights. The other used it on green lights. Well, the green light country increased accidents because what happens when there's a countdown timer and you have a green light? Do you hit the brake or do you hit the gas? Well, it appears that everyone, no matter what your ethnicity is, you hit the gas, right? And it created more accidents. The country that used the countdown timer on red lights saw a decrease in traffic accidents. The reason I bring that up is how you act, right? They both acted using countdown timers. It tells you either going to create more problems or you're going to help address the problem. We need to think about how it all connects to the surrounding environment that we're in. And the final countdown takes us to pause so that we can act to solve in a way that doesn't create more problems, but actually addresses the solution. And finally, in neuroscience, it comes from Donald Hebbs in 1949. By the way, that's an actual picture of the hippocampus, and it's called a brainbow. It's neurons colored with proteins. And in neuroscience, they say neurons that fire together, wire together. Well, I argue that people who compassionate together culminate together. And we can create more than rainbows. We can create real rainbows in our society if we choose to. Thank you, everyone, for your attention, and any questions I can answer. I think we have a few more minutes left, Jim.
Yeah, Chris, we do have a few stacked up in the chat here. So here's one. As a counselor, we're taught to have empathy for our clients to fully understand their experience. Would you agree or disagree with this instruction?
Simply said, I would disagree. I think you can get to an understanding of a person's problem without going through empathy. Empathy creates high levels of burnout. It's one of the reasons why before I came here, before the pandemic, a lot of hospitals had me go to speak for nurses. And that's actually one of the first places I actually gave talks were for doctors and nurses at my local hospital on this. I think if you're using empathy, it's one of the reasons why a lot of programs don't work, because they don't address or take into account the neuroscience of empathy. And I think when we create programs for us all, please let's look at the neuroscience of empathy and compassion before we build the programs. I think if we do that, we can use empathy so it's a little more controlled, Jim, right? That it's not jumps out of the fireplace and burns down the house, or burns literally leads to burnout in the counselors. Empathy can wear you down.
Okay. Would it be fair to assume high hope individuals are also high in compassion?
Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought of it like that. Wow. My first instinct is to say not necessarily, but I do think they go together. I think hope is about acting, right? And optimism, sometimes you're just wishing for something to happen, right? Where hope, you're actually getting out there. There's been studies done on this. And so it's similar to compassion in that way. But the reason I'm hesitant, Jim, is that hope can also be very geared towards the self. And compassion is outward looking. It thinks of the others. So think of it like this: the golden rule versus the platinum rule, right? Everyone knows the golden rule: do unto others as you would have want done to you, right? The platinum rule is do unto others that they would want done to them. It's very outward looking, right? So, and that's why I'm a little bit hesitant. I think they do go together, Jim, but I don't think it's automatic.
Okay. So when helping people, is it best to stay focused on logic rather than emotions?
Oh, no. Okay. That's another great question. Commander Spock of Star Trek was wrong, right? You can't, right? Oh, that's an awesome question. Antonio Damasio wrote a book in the 1990s. He's a Portuguese neuroscientist called Descartes' Error. And he was the first to show that you cannot have logic or rationality without emotion, right? Captain Kirk was more right in Star Trek, not Commander Spock. It blew my childhood because I thought Commander Spock was it. But neuroscience, right, through first Antonio Damasio, says that you need to have emotion. Don't leave the emotion out. You build logic on top of emotion, right? That movie Inside Out by Pixar, there's a lot to it that we can learn from. And no, don't leave the emotion out. Emotion matters, but don't go down the empathetic route.
Okay, so aside from the materials that you presented in your presentation, are there any other online modules or continuing education materials available that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's so I'll just give you two that I'm a part of. One is up on the board right now. For those of you looking for K through 12 work, I literally wrote the neuroscience for the Jesse Lewis Choose Love movement. It's a social emotional learning program that is in every state now in over 75 countries. So that will kind of give you some of the basic ideas of how to implement that in the K through 12. It's free of charge as well. So there should be no payment. If you do, please reach out to me. I will make sure that you get that free. It's free. The other I've been a part of for quite a while is the Charter for Compassion. And you can get them on the net, and they have a lot of resources there, and I've been a major part of their efforts in the past as well. So those are just two places you can go to. Also, I think diving into neuroscience on the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. And we have at the Science Museum of Virginia, I think one of the best neuroscientists in Dr. Catherine France. And so, hopefully we team up together and we come out with some more interesting information for y'all.
How do compassion, empathy, and sympathy relate to altruism?
So altruism, that's a great question too. Wow. I can be here all day. Altruism, a lot of times is at the cost of you, right? That when you're altruistic, you actually sacrifice some of your own, whatever it is. It could be your emotions, it could be money, it could be time, cost. Where compassion, you're actually looking for ways to help somebody that doesn't actually cost you a lot. And we always seem to look for the simple way of doing something. And that's either you do it, you're all in, or you're not. I think the compassion way, and that's why I called mine the middle way, you have to be a little more creative and innovative. You can help others without taking yourself down. And I think altruism, there's a great book on this called Strangers Drowning. And I'm so sorry to the author because I'm forgetting their name. But Strangers Drowning is all about altruism and showing that the depths that people would go to, like how many organs they would give over to somebody else to help someone else. Where compassion is, yeah, I'm going to help you, but we're going to build this together, right? We're going to find a way together. We're not going to, I'm not going to sacrifice everything that I have so that, you might live just one more day. We're going to find a way so it's sustainable for all of us to live a high quality. And that's the difference between altruism and compassion in my mind, right? This is open for debate. So this is just my take on it. But Strangers Drowning gives you plenty of stories that shows that the danger of altruism.
So I do have a question of my own. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between leadership and compassion?
Oh, I think the greatest leaders are the most compassionate leaders. I think that compassionate leadership bonds teams. I think it is the glue. And matter of fact, Jim, Jim did not tell me he was going to, ask me this question. But from my baseball days, you know what we call those guys in baseball? Literally, they're called the glue guys in baseball dugouts. You can go look this up. Sports Illustrated did a piece on this. Wall Street Journal did a piece on this. They're the people who take care of the other people on their team. They're not maybe the superstars, but they're the same people that go to winning teams, because compassion is that glue that binds us together. Darwin, Jim, was right about leadership, right? It's that looking after each other moves the entire group forward. In our honors college here at the Cormier Honors College, I like to say there are two types of type A personalities, right? And those type A's in honors become leaders. And I know this is not fair to just say there's just two types, but just go with me on this. There are sharks, really smart people who eat others to get ahead. I believe those smart people who are selfish did our 2008 economic crisis. They were just in it for themselves. And then you have Cormier Honors College students who are dolphins. They all swim together, so they all move together. I have students in the Cormier Honors College who take time out of their evening to tutor other Cormier Honors students so that all of them get better grades. So if they're weak in one area, say writing or math, there are students who just help each other. That doesn't happen everywhere. And so here we're looking to create citizen leaders at Longwood that have that compassion, that can create those bonds, those glues, that glue that move everyone forward. I don't think you're a real leader if you don't have compassion. I think you're faking it. And you know what? When you're faking it in this way, you're not making it. You're actually destroying it. So compassion and leadership, they're together.
Okay, so real quick follow-up question to that. I think this will have to be our last one. So in trying to introduce compassionate leadership into organizations, how do you get past that soft image that people unfortunately have of compassion?
Okay. Personally, I bring up the fact that I was a counterintelligence agent, right? Because people are freaked out the fact that how can a counterintelligence agent be for compassion? Well, I give a couple examples. Stalin versus the Pope, Enron versus Patagonia, water versus rock. Just as an example, Jim, rock's supposed to be really hard, but what soft element in the real world can cut through rock? Oh yeah, that's water. But let me give you another example of an interview that I wrote about in the book. You guys know of him through James Bond movies as M. Well, in the intelligence world, we called him C because it's chief of MI6. I literally asked him this question, and I bring this up when I go into organizations to build compassionate leadership. I was hoping that he would argue against my argument. I wanted someone to argue against. Instead, he allowed me to quote him to support my argument. He said that intelligence agents who are trying to get information, he goes, I remember him saying this, he goes, you Americans called it enhanced interrogation, right? It isn't enhanced, questioning, it's interrogation, it's torture. He goes, we tried that on the IRA. You know what we got? And this is his words. People who don't have the compassionate approach to gathering intelligence, you know what they get? They get the information they want, not the information they need. Where compassionate agents build bridges between the other so that they can get a true holistic understanding of the problem. And they get the information we need to address the problem. So Jim, tell me, if the head of MI6 believes that compassion is the key for unlocking and protecting the security of a country. Oh, and he told us that if you were that blow him up, shoot him out, take out James Bond type that appears in the movies, we take your badge and weapon away. So tell me, if the chief of MI6 believes compassion is, who do you have? All right, and that's what I would ask. Who is your model? Because the only models I can think of that take that on, other than my drill sergeants and some of my football coaches, are the Adolf Hitlers of the world, who forget about the value and the sacredness of every human being. I believe everyone on my team has a lot to give, and compassion unlocks those resources. Don't tell me when you intimidate someone, you're unlocking their potential. Science shows it quite the other way. Oh, and the chief of MI6 agrees with that.
Chris, I will say that in my 28-year military career, there is a strong correlation between the best leaders and the most compassionate leaders.
Well, thanks for your service, Jim.
Thank you for yours. So with that, we are out of time for today, so I'm going to have to bring this to a close. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Chris Kukk for helping us discover more about our world. Please join us next week on Wednesday, March 31st at noon for the Science of Regulation in Children and Teens. That's going to be presented by Michelle Schmitz, who is Child Development Specialist at Child Savers, and Katie Reynolds, a licensed professional counselor and certified trauma and resilience practitioner. So definitely do join us for that. You can register for next week's talk at smb.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.